Before we start this episode, we'll be discussing the topic of self-harm. While we approach this conversation with care and compassion, some of the themes may be distressing for certain listeners. Please do take care while listening, and if you or someone you know is struggling, there are support services available. You'll find links in the show notes. Tourette Syndrome, like many other neurodivergents, is stigmatised, misunderstood and stereotyped. Today's chat is one that lies really close to my heart. My beautiful niece, Alma, was diagnosed with Tourette Syndrome when she was 7. I wanted to invite my brother Magnus on to help educate us all further, alongside Katie Skinner from Tourette's Action, the only national charity in the UK dedicated to supporting individuals with Tourette syndrome and their families. Magnus has gone down his own inspiring path of discovery in his neurodivergence that was masked for years as depression, and I'm so unbelievably proud of what he has overcome and achieved, not only as a father, but also with his recent career highlight becoming concertmaster at the Royal Opera House. Katie Skinner is an education specialist for the NHS Community Paediatric Services in Kent. She has worked for the last 15 years as a specialist advisory teacher, developing inclusive practices and providing advice, support and practical strategies to education settings to improve engagement and upskill teachers. In Katie's words, I'm the very proud big sister of Elliot, who has Tourette's. As he is 10 years younger than me, I have watched him navigate teenage years, university and start a career. Katie regularly volunteers at conferences for Tourette's Action, speaking about a range of topics for both parents and professionals, including education provision, emotional regulation, executive function, anxiety and sleep. Katie has now joined Tourette's Action permanently in leading and organising events, and in May this year, Tourette's Action released the most amazing short film, reimagining Nina Simone's iconic song, Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood, performed by Grace and a choir of individuals with Tourette syndrome, to challenge the stigma that still surrounds the syndrome. Both Katie and Magnus only wish for a world that enables people living with Tourette syndrome to be accepted, embraced, and able to reach their full potential. Some things we covered in the episode today include the social discomfort Tourette's can cause, both for the individual and those around them, and why that discomfort shouldn't exist, intrusive thoughts, and the reality that some tics can be dangerous, like urges to touch hot surfaces or sharp objects. We talk about Magnus's self-discovery through Alma's diagnosis, and Katie's What If board, a simple but powerful tool to help children manage stress and anxiety. And finally, the brilliant work of Tourette's Action and how they support individuals and families across the UK. So welcome, Magnus and Katie, to the podcast. And today's a really special episode. I mean, they're all very special. And lots of the topics have been close to my heart. But this one affects our family. Our niece, Alma, my brother's daughter, was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. How old was she, Mag?
Around 7.
Around 7.
Yeah.
Would you mind talking us a little bit through Alma's journey and how it came about?
Yeah, so there were sort of two kind of big moments that made us think something was perhaps not 100% okay for Alma. And the first was the weekend, and you probably remember this, is when she physically was unable to control her body.
Yeah, I do remember.
It was an extreme episode of tics, physical tics, and we were really worried. And I don't know if you remember when we were at home. Mum had her kind of on her lap and was just kind of caring for her because she couldn't really control her body. So we took her to the hospital, I remember, and because we thought she might be having seizures. And, at this point we didn't have a clue what it could be. It was just a very unusual thing. And that probably lasted a few days and then disappeared. And it was very strange. And then everything was fine. And then I can't be totally precise with the timeline, but the next episode was from one day to the next when she started this shriek, this kind of high shriek. And that was a really extreme moment when we thought, this feels really strange. And that lasted several weeks, nearly 6 to 8 weeks, where every few seconds she was screaming, shrieking, really, really super loud and very, very powerful. And I think that was the moment when we started to seek help.
And if we rewind a little bit, because obviously I've known Alma since the day she was born, and she is very similar age to Lola. They are weeks apart. And
3 weeks
so,
apart,
yeah, 3 weeks apart. And so a lot of their development has gone side by side. And there's always that classic, so-and-so's doing this, and so-and-so's reached this milestone. But one of the kind of clear differences between Alma and Lola at the beginning was there was a big sleep thing, wasn't there? And every time, I remember when Alma was trying to settle to sleep, her body would move. She was kind of, wasn't she? She was sort of restless.
She's always been restless, hasn't she?
Yeah.
And physically unable to keep still.
Yeah.
Really. And that's still
the
very
case.
much the case.
But so even though there was this very frightening episode, probably prior to that, there were subtle tics going on.
Absolutely. And I think Mireille especially, so Mireille obviously being my wife, she is now able to look back at various films and stuff, and now it's obvious. The blinking, there's signs of tics, which of course when you're new parents you just don't see the signs, but it was really those two very strong episodes that kind of flagged it up. I think otherwise it would have just been, it's not so obvious.
So Katie, let's just bring you in here and let's talk about what Tourette syndrome is, and let's be very clear about what the difference is between tics, Tourette syndrome, and how it can be diagnosed.
Okay, so Tourette syndrome is a complex neurological disorder, and it's characterised by tics, and it is lifelong for those people who experience it. And the tics can be motor or vocal. So it might be that young people experience simple tics or complex tics, and sometimes both together. A simple vocal tic might be something like coughing or clearing your throat. A simple motor tic might be like blinking. A complex vocal tic might be using a whole word or a phrase, and a complex motor tic might be jumping or spinning. And the difference between tics and Tourette's really is the number and the regularity with which you're having your tics. So for a diagnosis of Tourette's, you would be looking at young people having at least 2 motor tics and at least 1 vocal tic over a period of 12 months or more. And I think that there are other types of tic disorder, and so sometimes there's a diagnosis of Tourette's and sometimes people simply talk about tics, but the presentation is the same in terms of the way that you kind of experience those tics. There's a real spectrum in terms of the severity of tics, and I think for me one of the things that comes with is a misapprehension that the severity of your tics correlates with the severity of the impact or the severity of the anxiety that you might experience. Some people with very complex, very severe tics don't feel anxious about it, don't feel worried about it, and conversely some people with very, comparatively mild tics might feel really worried about them or might feel that has a kind of very big impact on their life. In terms of prevalence, it's much more common than people think. So about 1 in 100 school-age children will be diagnosed with Tourette's. That's a very similar prevalence rate to autism. And I think if you consider the amount of information we have about autism, quite rightly, but the amount of knowledge there is about what that might look like in classrooms and support that you can access compared to Tourette's, there's a real disparity there.
And actually trying to get support in the classroom for a neurodivergence that is more recognised is hard enough. So I can imagine the additional layer, and it's also teachers being trained in the conditions.
Absolutely. And so I'm a teacher by trade, and most teachers, when they're learning about SEN, get 1 day worth of SEN training. I'm sure you've come across this before. So it's not always a lack of desire on the part of teachers. It's often that they simply don't have access to the type of information they need. And the same is true of GPs, and often people go to their GP and find that perhaps they're not as aware as they would like, or don't have the kind of supported background to understand the tics that are presenting in doctor surgeries.
Also, I think, like so many neurodivergents, there is a picture that we have of what we think it is.
Absolutely.
And with Tourette's, it's been almost made a characterised version of it, where people assume that it is swearing.
Absolutely.
But actually, that is a different name.
Yes.
That's
that. What you're referring to is called Copra phenomenon, and it fits within the Tourette's diagnosis. But only about 10 to 20% of people with tics and Tourette's will have Copra phenomenon. And you might have coprolalia, which is either using a swear word or an inappropriate word. You might have copopraxia, which is where you use a hand gesture or a body gesture, or you might have copographia, which is where you might write or type an inappropriate or an offensive word. And as I say, only between 10 to 20% of people with Tourette's will have that kind of particular profile to their tics. But it's the thing you see most commonly on television, and it's the thing that's most sort of talked about and noticed about Tourette's.
If somebody is diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, can they then develop?
Yes, theoretically. That's a really kind of tough one to answer, because everybody's tics present so differently. Not everybody will develop a kind of coprolalia as part of their Tourette's. Sometimes people with complex tics do go on to develop those types of tics. There isn't a kind of hard and fast rule, but what we do know about tics is they wax and wane. And so you may notice periods where tics come and go. So you mentioned with Alma that some of the tics that she's experienced in the past she hasn't kept, and they're not still part of her tic repertoire, for want of a better phrase. But I think for some people that can be a worry. And I meet a lot of young people who say, will I start swearing? Or is this going to happen to me? I can't always give a clear answer there, because there isn't one. If you have very stable tics over a long period of time, so years and months, then you might find that isn't going to be the profile of your tics.
Magnus, just thinking about the moment that Alma started to really, I guess, actually have the freedom to allow her tics. I remember Maria saying to me about how awful she felt, because Alma used to scrape her knife on the plate when she was eating, and Maria used to stop scraping your knife. Yeah. And then Alma said to her, once the tics were becoming, I suppose, more of an open dialogue, I can't, I'm something's making me do it. I don't want to do it. Does she talk to you much about the sort of impulsivities or the compulsions that she has? Because I think it's important to know what the body movement or what else she wants to do that she is holding back a lot of the time.
So I think the initial shock was huge for us. We agreed as a family, so myself and Maria and our little boy Otto, who's 2 years younger than Alma, that we would never comment on her tics ever in a negative way. So I suppose our dream is to be able to talk about them in a positive way and find humour in them, because we accept that this is there to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about trying to give Alma an environment that she feels free in. So I think, yes, Maria and I will have a quiet moment to ourselves where we feel really sad about the past and how perhaps we might have approached it to begin with when we didn't know what it was. And I think particularly Maria has a lot of regret, not because she's, as you know, far
Wonderful.
from able
Yeah.
to be unkind in any way, but I think she would have approached it immediately from the compassionate side. But we weren't to know.
No.
But, you know, the dream situation for us as a family is for her safe space at home, and she can do whatever she needs to do at home. And and Otto at the age of 6 took that on board, has never ever commented on a tic, even when she was screaming in our ears. He never flinched, which is, I think, amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting what you say about kind of how that felt at the beginning, and looking back on it, wishing you hadn't told a child not to tic or to hold in their tics. That's a really common thing that families talk to me about, the worry and the shame that they feel for not knowing and for not understanding right at the beginning. And I think that families can feel very lonely at that point, at the point where they're navigating diagnosis, at the point where they get that diagnosis. What does this mean? What does our future look like? But also at the point where they understand the tics, perhaps for the first time, and reflect on some of the things that have happened at home. And I think it's really important that families know that's common, because that isn't something anybody did with anything other than love and care and good parenting. I think that one of the things that is interesting about tics is that they are involuntary. So you don't consciously choose to do them. They're happening without kind of a voluntary element to them. Some people can suppress tics. And for some young people, that can be for seconds or minutes or maybe even hours. It takes a huge amount of concentration to do that, and a great deal of willpower. And it can also be quite uncomfortable. Sometimes young people talk to me about it being painful to suppress those tics. And the fact that it can be suppressed often leads to a misunderstanding that means it can be controlled. And that you could stop if you wanted to. And that isn't the case with Tourette's. It's kind of distinct within Tourette's. And I think that's really important for families that people understand that. But also that, you know, once we have understanding, once we're able to recognise them as tics, not asking young people to suppress them, because what then happens is... And sometimes young people choose to suppress them. And I think we can explore that, work out, why are you doing that? Is it for your benefit, somebody else's benefit? What's the point of that? But where you feel the pressure to do it, and I know that's not the case in your family, but where you feel that pressure, what that interrupts is learning, and interrupts your ability to engage with things. So I see in classrooms, young people, if you're focused on suppressing your tics, you're not listening to the teacher, you're not engaging with your work, you're not watching what your friends are doing and joining in socially. And that's really problematic for young people.
I could see that could also be misinterpreted by someone who's not aware.
Yes.
And therefore understanding that the child can't concentrate in a neurotypical way in a classroom.
Absolutely.
Is very important.
And I think about sort of my own family and my own lived experience talking about tics, that for my brother, he openly talked about the fact that one of the biggest difficulties was things that he had to do very quickly. So when he was at university, I remember him telling me that when he was doing activities in sort of breakout groups, he only had a few minutes to do it and then they had to come back. But obviously, if you've had a tic halfway through listening and you've been a little bit distracted by your tic, and if you're with a new group of people and they're noticing your tics, that distracts you from being able to pay attention. So things that were happening very quickly, he kind of felt quite uncomfortable with because he didn't have time to think that through. And he's a really intelligent person. Oh. So that was really tricky. But I think, you know, lots of the young people I've worked with, taught, and families I've supported talk about that impact where you know other people notice your tics, and that can be very public. So you don't have a choice to not talk about that today, to perhaps go to the cinema and for it not to be a thing other people are noticing. And so I remember speaking to a young person once who said that one of the difficulties they had was that they were forced to be an advocate for Tourette's. that maybe today I don't want to talk about Tourette's, maybe today I just want to go and watch Jurassic Park. But actually, because other people noticed, there were questions, there were conversations, there was stigma and judgment, and people who get it can be really supportive, and people who don't can be very judgmental. And I remember sitting with an adult with Tourette's once having breakfast, and in a hotel dining room, and I could see a couple at the next table sort of noticing, judging, thinking it was inappropriate, kind of talking about it. The person I was with wasn't bothered by that. I found it really hard because there was a bit of me that wanted to go over and say, hi, I work for Tourette's Action, can I talk to you about Tourette's? But that wasn't appropriate for the moment. That wasn't fair on the person I was with. That wasn't what they wanted. And I think that at the heart of all these conversations is a human being with feelings. And what they feel is right for them, what they want to be represented, is the most important part of that conversation.
I remember a conversation I had with Magnus very soon after Alma's very, very vocal tics and the screams that were happening. And I've spoken about this many times, but our oldest brother had a very serious car accident and he is brain damaged. And he doesn't have any physical disability, so it's all cognitive. And ever since we were younger, being out in social situations with Rupert could be very uncomfortable because his behaviour was not what people perceived to be appropriate. And I think that was a big trigger for you with Alma being out in public.
That was the initial shock, I think. Yeah, that I can remember exactly when we spoke and it was that trigger for social discomfort. And it was like a double whammy for me because, you know, I'd suffered enough trauma with Roops and continue to in terms of how we feel in his company and that difficulty seeing him not having a normal life. And I think that is when this started for Alma. I couldn't help draw parallels to someone whose life is kind of has this potential social difficulty. And, you know, that's something I've been on an enormous journey, as you know, to, and I would say the most important thing for me as a father to someone with Tourette's is actually my acceptance has been massive. And I think the day that Maria and I accepted Alma's fate was the day things started to happen. And I think the day we started to be so positive, you know, there's so much to celebrate in Alma. And I think what I'm learning from this whole experience is that it's absolutely irrelevant who someone is. You know, it's about compassion, it's about understanding that everyone is different. And why should someone with tics feel uncomfortable? And for me, that's the big journey. It's like, and our mission statement as a family really is, we just want Alma to be comfortable in the future with this situation and not hide behind it. Because I think in those early months, it was a rather lovely week because my wife's Dutch and both the children were born in Holland. And someone in Maria's NCT class in Holland, her son has Tourette's. And when the vocal tics started, funny enough, we were going to Holland to have a music festival. And so I was just so shocked by the whole thing and felt just so deeply sad about what was happening in front of us. And within a few days, I was speaking to a young boy, 15-year-old with Tourette's. And, it was just, there were a couple of things that he said. I mean, I sort of sat there just in awe of this 15-year-old. I mean, I just was blown away by just his maturity. Someone that's suffering this really these public difficulties. And he said one of the things that he said to me was, my isolation is the thing that really gets me. And I thought, for me, that was what tipped me over. It was the isolation stories that...
And I think that's often one of the really challenging things for families. And there's so much to Tourette's. It's not just swearing, and Tourette's is many things, but it's almost always misunderstood and oversimplified. And some people have really severe tics. Some people have comparatively mild tics. For some people, it's deeply isolating. For others, it isn't. And I think that those stereotypes and sort of sweeping generalisations can be so damaging for families. But I also think that there are lots of parts of the Tourette's that aren't talked about very much. So one of those is pain. Tics can be extremely painful, and they can be, in some instances, debilitating. So
physically.
Absolutely. So if you've got quite physical tics, for example, if you've got a really strong neck tic where you fling your head back or you stretch the muscles in your neck, you might really kind of strain your neck. Or I recently met somebody who's one of her tics is that she bangs her fist into her stomach, and she might do that 100 times a day with quite a bit of force, and that can leave bruising or make you very sore. There are some people who are very, the range of human emotions. Some people are very confident, who don't feel worried about that, and other people who feel differently. And I think that going back to that feeling of needing to be an advocate for Tourette's just because you've got Tourette's, that's one of the tricky things, I think, for lots of families. And deciding, well, what does this look like for us? What are the barriers for us? And what does the world of work look like? What does the world of university or further education look like? What is going to be easy or difficult for our family? Is that going to impact on dating or exercise or just kind of everyday activities that you want to do? And I think as people become more aware of things like autism or ADHD, there are more kind of neurodiverse friendly places, and there's more acceptance and awareness as a general society. But for families, I think they often are faced with a lot more questions than everybody else might experience.
Can we talk a little bit about Tourette's in school?
Yes.
I realise that there are lots of wonderful education settings who are incredibly inclusive and very understanding, but there are also a lot of settings which need more understanding, more education. And I heard a story actually from a friend of ours whose nephew has Tourette's, who, despite, they actually contacted Tourette's Action because he was very worried about transitioning from year 2 to year 3 with a new teacher who didn't understand. Yeah. And he went with all the leaflets. He'd been to a festival or an event that Tourette's Action put on. He went to his teacher with all the leaflets to explain about his Tourette's and was really proud about it. And on the first day, he was removed from the classroom for being a distraction. And my heart broke because there he was, really trying to, advocate, and his parents really wanted to try to help the school and inform the school. And, obviously class of 30.
Yeah. And I've heard empowering stories and terribly sad stories over the years.
Of course.
And I think there are examples of both. Mm-hmm. I think that there are lots of teachers who want to do the right thing or to support their young people but don't have the support themselves to manage that. But as a teacher, but also if you're kind of thinking about education settings, the number one thing I would do is talk to the young person. They are an expert on their tics and on their own needs, and I think we should treat them as such. I would add a kind of note of caution to that you need to have also spoken to the parents and decided what is appropriate here. How are we going to do this? Not ask them in front of the whole class, not ask them in a way that feels invasive, but having that kind of open conversation with the family. What is appropriate here? What is needed here? I would also kind of really be keen to reflect on the fact that what one person needs will be different for what somebody else needs. So what is a reasonable adjustment, and having a little plan for what those might look like. So I've met young people who can't bear quiet classrooms because they feel like their tics are really noticeable and they feel really embarrassed and worried about them. So the noisier and the kind of louder classrooms are, the better. But I've also known some young people who feel that the quieter it is, the calmer the environment, the easier it is to do their work. So they might really thrive on going outside of the classroom, sitting on a little table by themselves and having a few quiet moments. For some young people, it's about having a backup plan or a get out of the situation plan, so that you know, if this happens, this is how I'm going to respond. And a strategy that I often talk about in schools, which I wish I'd trademarked because I'd have made my fortune, but strategy I talk about a lot, I refer to as a what-if board. And it's based on some of the strategies within cognitive behavioural therapy. But essentially, you recognise the problems that are, or the worries that you've got, and you catastrophise them, and you say, okay, what if that does happen? What if you feel that you need to leave the classroom? What if the chair that you're sat on is no longer comfortable? Or what if somebody says something? Or what if you accidentally hurt somebody with your tics? You know, what if? And you go through all of those worries and you come up with a plan. Because knowing what you're going to do in that situation often removes the worry about it and alleviates that worry, and means it's less likely to happen, but also means that you feel prepared in the situation, more able to manage it. And when I talk to families about that, particularly in schools, recognising that you've got some control over what happens in some of those tricky situations.
And for all our neurodivergent kids, to give them the tools to advocate their needs.
Absolutely.
From as young as possible, so that they have their toolbox of, this is what I'm going to do in this situation.
When there's that clear agreement between the teacher and the family that in this situation, this is how we're all going to respond, it means that the teacher sort of feels empowered, but so does the young person, and everybody feels like they're doing the right thing. And I've known some young people whose tics were triggered by excitement. And so Christmas was particularly challenging. And I met a lovely sort of Miss Honey teacher who said to me, shall I try and make it less exciting, and I'll take some of the activities out? No, life is too short not to have those joys. But we recognise that we might need a few more breaks during that part of the year, and those opportunities to have a time out. The other thing I would say in schools is having an environment and a culture of understanding. So giving training not just to the classroom teacher but to the whole staff, and empowering the children to know. And you might do that through assemblies. There's some great videos out there. There's a lot of resources. Again, being mindful, what does that young person want? They might not be ready to talk about it with everybody, or they might be delighted. And the young person you're mentioning, you know, went with the leaflets and said, please, let's talk about this. In that situation, it'd be really appropriate to talk about assemblies and to talk about, is this something we can have as one of our topics in class? But that's just good practice for all needs. You know, the likelihood that you might have a friend or a sibling or somebody in your life with Tourette's at some point is relatively high, in just the same way that it is for autism or ADHD. Making our young people more aware of need just makes them more inclusive, kinder human beings. It's only going to kind of help us level the playing field. So it's just good practice.
Magnus,
Absolutely.
with Alma's tics, do you find that if she is told, or not necessarily with Alma, I guess this is just a general question. So is the practice that you don't comment on the tics that are happening? Is that better for the person? Does it make an impact if they feel the tension that they're not supposed to be ticking? Does that make it worse, or are they just presenting as they will always present?
The general rule is that unless tics are dangerous, or unless they're deeply painful or they're causing kind of active damage, the best thing to do is to not engage with the tic and to let it happen, because you can create a kind of more complicated tic if you're stepping in. And an example I think is quite a good one is from a family I once knew, and they had a little boy with Tourette's, and one of his tics is that he would sort of stop sort of mid walk and fall to the floor, and often that would mean he'd skinned his knee or he'd hurt himself. And his mum's gut reaction was to run to him and wrap her arms around him and lift him up and cuddle him, because that's what any mum would want to do, or any dad would want to do. And actually that was really reinforcing the tic, because the final part of the tic was getting the cuddle and the squeeze. And so sometimes people find that the more you engage with the tic, the more you reinforce it.
Magnus, I think our first experience of Tourette's was at school.
Yeah.
So we were at music school in Manchester, and there was a phenomenal pianist called Yusuke who had Tourette's.
Yeah.
And I remember this...
Very, very complex Tourette's, wasn't it?
Okay, and I remember this assembly where the head teacher was trying to give us the new door code into the music department, which was 4 numbers. And every time the headmaster said a number, Yusuke would shout out another number.
Yeah.
And so this assembly went on, didn't it? And, but there was so much affection for Yusuke within the school.
It was, and yet, I knew nothing of the condition.
No.
And also didn't really educate myself either. I just knew Yusuke was this extraordinary musical talent and he definitely had the swearing... the Copulalia version, and actually I was uneducated, and actually nothing was done at the school to educate really.
No, that's true. There
if
was,
you think back, and he was loved and understood in a way, but
and when he played the piano, he was at peace.
Completely at peace, yeah.
And some people do talk about particular activities that really help them, and so for some people focus on favoured activities like music, drama. I know some young people that like to sew, or that are very creative. Exercise is often really focused on as a way to decrease the rate and severity of tics. And different families will talk to you about different tricks that they've got, or different activities that work for them. But conversely, there might be some things that make it much worse and that really trigger your tics. So people often talk about, natural stressors, so the lead up to exam periods, or having to take your driving test, all those kind of high pressure life moments. Not exclusively, but for some people. And also kind of families recognising that there are certain places or certain things that might make them feel stressed. And that was never more obvious to me than during COVID, because we, Tourette's Action as a charity, had hundreds of emails and hundreds of calls about, well, my tic is a cough. And right now, how do I manage that in a public space where I need to queue up to get my vegetables at Sainsbury's, and I'm stood behind somebody and I'm coughing? And the more I think about the fact that I don't want to cough, more that is, something that I feel the need to complete.
Are there any activities or moments where you see a level of peace in Alma?
Very much so, yeah. I mean, I think, as you said, exercise and Alma has always gone together, hasn't it? And she, as long as she's busy and moving, and just picking up on the environment sort of things, we've learned that Alma's very much the person that if she was in here now, for example, in this sort of quiet space, she'd find that really difficult. And I think if she's in the class, so there was a class, I think they had quite a long sort of lecture at a museum, and they were all in a small room, and I think she had a really, really tough day that day. And I think that's, the what ifs that you mentioned, I think this is amazing, because I think it's finding that openness to say what you need. And I think that's part of it for us. We don't want Alma to be isolated. She needs to be able to understand what's difficult for her. The teachers need to know that, what she needs to feel better. And we've done a lot of that at home. So the first thing we did was buy the trampoline. We learnt quite quickly that because she's a very impressive masker, and she obviously feels that she needs to do that. She wants to do that. Often when she comes home, and I say this as if I'm at home, but quite often I'm not. 'Cause I'm away playing. But Maria will often Alma will go into these extreme rages because she's been sort of keeping all the tics inside, and she comes home and then unleashes the energy. So the trampoline was brilliant for that, because we can say, look, go and jump on the trampoline. Now she'll take herself off for ages and do the backflips.
Yeah.
And, she's just non-stop. And then she comes in, I think she feels released.
I've met a lot of very creative people in the Tourette's community who've sort of thought, right, how can I box clever here? How can I think of something that will support me, or that will make this tic manageable, or stop it being a barrier? I had a brilliant conversation with a young lady at Christmas who really loved crocheting, but she'd got quite a strong tic in her wrist. And so she'd got the sort of hand brace that you use if you've got carpal tunnel. So she found that if she'd strapped up her hand, and that if she used a sort of particular hand position while she was crocheting, she could manage that tic more effectively. But she met a couple of other crochet enthusiasts at this tic event, and so they were sort of swapping tips. What do you use and what have you got? And so and that's a wonderful thing about the Tourette's community. There's a lot of mutual support there. Not everything is going to work for everybody, not least because I can't think of anything worse than crocheting. For some people that isn't going to be their motivator. But I think where there are things that you do want to engage with, but you feel there's a barrier, there are people out there who can support you. There are lots of people who might have ideas about support strategies or solutions, and that doesn't diminish the impact of the tics. It doesn't diminish how difficult it is going to be for some people to access the things they want to access, but it does mean that you've got a bit more control, and that you feel like, okay, this is my life, this is the reality for me, and I do want to be able to go to the cinema. So what does that look like for me? What if for me, and then what are my solutions for me?
There's a couple of things that I really want to cover, but just before I do, Katie, can we just signpost, so if people are listening and they are perhaps going through struggles with a diagnosis, or not knowing where to turn, or perhaps haven't been given that support, how can Tourette's Action help? Where will they lead them to?
Okay, so the first port of call is our website, and there's all sorts of different pieces of information on the website depending on what your need is. So we've got information sheets, we've got numbers for organisations that might be able to help you. Across the country, we have parent groups and support groups, some of them for families, some of them specifically for dads. So a great range of support groups. So whatever area you're in, you will be able to find people who are local to you, who've got kind of lived experience in your area. We've got a helpline, which you mentioned, Magnus, that if you feel like you've got a question but you're not sure where to start, often phoning the helpline is most people's first port of call, and enables them to kind of have their question answered. But equally, we've got a chat online, so people can send us their questions. Somebody will always get back to you. So I would say starting with the website and just reaching out to us. If the information you're looking for isn't obviously there, contact us and we will help you find what you need.
So I just wanted to spend a moment talking to Magnus, actually, a little bit just about his journey, for want of a better word, through your daughter, really. And Maria sent me this amazing picture of Tourette's, like an iceberg.
Yeah.
And at the top, you've got the vocal tics and the motor tics, but is the tip of the iceberg. But underneath, you've got all the other I don't want to say symptoms, doesn't sound like the right word, but you've got things on there like anxiety, sleep issues, ADHD, OCD, so rage.
Probably refer to them as co-occurrences.
Okay.
And there is a relatively high rate of co-occurrence within Tourette's. Most information seems to suggest that 90% of people with Tourette's will have a co-occurrence of some type.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for giving me the correct terminology. So before Alma was diagnosed with Tourette's, she was diagnosed with ADHD. And during the process of filling out the forms for her, you sort of had a bit of a light bulb moment, because you were thinking...
Well, I had a light bulb moment through this whole process.
Okay.
So I think, it's been a gift to have Alma in the first place, because she's wonderful. And, we'll never, ever see this condition as an ailment. Far from.
No.
This is who she is. This is the person that we're bringing up. And she comes with this. condition, so that's the kind of first thing. But for me to be able to get to the point to say that with peace in myself has been a big old journey. So that took a lot of work, because we talked about the trauma of Rupert. This was like a secondary trauma which triggered a lot of our childhood trauma through Rupert's accident and everything that brought. And I think it was a flagpole in, right, if I'm going to help Alma, I need to do something really serious now to make myself as good as I can possibly be for her, so that I can be the person that she needs. So that's the journey I went on. So as I said, that for Maria and I, the day that we accepted was huge, because initially I was like, oh, poor Alma, and what's going to happen in the future, and I feel so bad, and socially she's going to be taken advantage of, and how's it going to be, and all these things that worry you. And in a way I was bringing it back to me, and it's not about me, it's Alma who's living with this condition. So it sort of represents that acceptance, sort of went alongside me, as we've talked about it a lot, my stopping my drinking, and I because I felt very depressed, but that was never going to help her. So I'm sort of slightly digressing, but I think it's important for the story, because I was sat in front of the TV in tears watching Lewis Capaldi at Glastonbury and drawing the parallels, and it can be it feels so sad to see someone struggling like that. And I think seeing all those things, I think you can fall into two camps. You can put yourself to the side and just be as good as you can be to deal with what is in front of you, which for Alma is, she has the tics, but there's also, as you mentioned, all the things underneath. So she's got really, really extreme anxiety. She has intrusive thoughts. So, the most recent one to Maria was, are you my mum? Are you really my mum? So something inside her was sort of saying, you're not my mum. Please tell me you're my mum. Intrusive thoughts seems to be quite a big sort of side-by-side thing for her. Anyway, I've sort of totally gone off track, but just my own personal journey, in order to help Alma the best that we can, Maria and I had to obviously do a lot of work on ourselves, so that we didn't feel victims. Oh, but our daughter has Tourette's or whatever. It's just, this is who she is, and this is what we face, and we're inspired and motivated to help her as best as we can. But also, like with the marathon and stuff, I feel so motivated to support the charity, Tourette's Action, because I think it's amazing that these charities exist in an area that is so misunderstood. And until it's you just, all these charities are going on around us, but unless it affects you in a way, you don't really think about it. But it's everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the reason that I did want to spend a moment just celebrating your achievements, just for me as a sister, what I have witnessed through what's happened for Alma actually has given you this amazing, deeper understanding of yourself that perhaps you may never have come to had you not sort of been forced. And I think, we've talked, you touched briefly there with drinking, but also your ADHD diagnosis, which I think throughout your life you thought was a depression.
Yeah.
And actually, since discovering what it is, you've been able to almost breathe a sigh of relief.
Yeah, I mean, that was huge. I mean, it was quite funny, because that was Tara Murphy at Great Ormond Street who sort of said, I think you should get yourself tested for ADHD, because, she was talking about the parallels and the how these conditions can be passed through generations and things like that. And but no, absolutely is, I think.
And also
the way I can help Alma now with, because I can see the blocks that come with ADHD for me. You know, and Alma has that to a very extreme. She's really super hyper, and she's got all of the things that I have, but even more extreme, I think, in a way. And just being able to help her, you know, when you get those blocks, when you just get overwhelmed, and you know, and then you feel bad about yourself because you're just not that person that can organise through whatever it is that's in front of you. Sometimes life just gets a bit overwhelming, and and I see that in Alma, and so no.
But you know, I think I want to spend this moment because you've always been inspiring to me, but watching you through this process has been truly admirable, both you and Maria. And I think, you know, we've both been on difficult parenting experiences, and I know for my child, being able to say Uncle Magnus has ADHD has been really, really helpful. And we are talking about it openly. We are accepting as a family, and we are teaching our children to grow up in a generation that accepts difference and embraces difference. And, you know, the whole point of having the conversations that I've had on Let's Talk Neurodivergent Kids is because I think, you know, in the media, we can hear all these conversations at the moment about ADHD and, you know, neurodivergence and all the rest of it. But underneath that are real life and real people and real human stories that have been affecting people without knowing it for years. And you are one of those people who have lived not with a clear understanding, and the impact that that's had on your mental health was huge.
Yeah.
And similarly, I assume for a child with Tourette's who has been misunderstood, the mental health challenges that come as a result of that.
Yeah, and I think that having suffered from a lot of depression, of course, I hear the stories of the self-harming that can come with Tourette's. You know, I have a great fear, which is that Alma could develop disorders, whether they be eating disorders or self-harming or just self-loathing, self-bashing, all the things that I fought even without having the condition of Tourette's.
One of the things this really raises for me is the importance of people being able to access services, because where people are seeking those answers and where people are looking for an assessment and a diagnosis, that is not something that's easily accessible when it comes to Tourette's. There was a recent study by the University of Nottingham, and they sent out a Freedom of Information survey looking at what support was in place in England. And in their study, they found that less than 5% of the areas in the country have a full diagnostic pathway and offering treatment and support. And actually 90% of the country has no service. Wow. And over half of people who were assessed for Tourette's, and this came from a NICE survey in 2024, over half of people who were assessed for Tourette's were assessed and discharged at the same appointment and were offered no ongoing treatments. And there are some good treatments available with kind of relatively good efficacy rates. Not everybody wants to explore treatment options, and I think it's really important that's recognised, that anybody with Tourette's has the right to decide what is appropriate for them. My personal view on it is everybody has the right to choice. And how can you know what's right for you if you have no choice? And so I think it's really important that one of the things that we're doing when we're raising awareness, things like the marathon, is we're talking about this isn't just about people understanding Tourette's. This is also about people being able to access care at the point of need through the NHS. And that's a kind of real barrier for families at the moment.
Thank you so much to both of you. Before we finish, I would love to for both of you to just tell me, we'll start with you, Katie, if there was one thing that you could see change for our children living with Tourette syndrome, what would it be?
So I would like to see a national specified pathway for assessment and diagnosis, so that people seeking assessment and diagnosis have a clear way forward, so that they feel supported from start to end of that process, and so that young people like Alma and all of the young people that we've mentioned today feel that they didn't have to wait, that they didn't have to search, and that they didn't have those feelings of loneliness and isolation that just aren't necessary.
I think the stigma of Tourette's, the big one is the lack of knowledge for what it is. I think Tourette's, I don't know to what percentage, is swearing, and it's so much more than that. So I think a deeper understanding of what Tourette's is, and to understand what's underneath in the individual. Quite often the tics are just the tip of the iceberg, and it's everything else. So for me it's just the awareness, it's the broader awareness of the condition.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Neurodivergent Kids. Please do share it with someone else who you think might need to hear it too. For any support or advice, please visit the Tourette's Action website, which is tourettesaction.org.uk. And don't forget to follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying the series, a quick rating or review helps us to reach even more parents, carers and educators. Thanks again for being part of this growing community, and I'll catch you next time on Let's Talk Neurodivergent Kids.